Drops. Drops are means for one party to pass information, materials, or equipment to another without making direct contact. The top reasons for using a drop are either exchanges in less permissive environments or exchanges between residents. While there may be many reasons for using drops, the point is to use it when direct contact is not secure, possible, or proper. In some of the most permissive environments, drops may not be necessary, as face-to-face contacts could be secure enough to pass compromising materials. However, this may not be so in less permissive environments. In regions of the world where the indigenous are hostile towards clandestine relationships or operations, there exists a possibility that the adversary or an agent thereof could interrupt the contact. When such a risk exists, it is best to keep compromising evidence away from direct encounters. Sometimes one resident needs what another resident has. In such cases, especially when it is sensitive in nature, the less hands that touch it, including the principal's hands, the more secure it is. It is still the principal's responsibility to coordinate exchanges. The principal should be the one who notifies the separate parties of when to load and unload the drops. If such coordination cannot take place, then it would be up to the principal to take what would be one less than secure drop and turn it into two more secure drops. The principal uses drops to pass contents that enable residents to perform their specific tasks. When a resident uses a drop, it is often to return the result of his assigned task. Neither participants nor the drop can be under surveillance when unloading. Taking possession of compromising material under surveillance is unacceptable. Doing so may compromise the operation. However, loading a drop may be proper under surveillance if surveillance cannot recognize the act of loading. Depending on what the principal or a resident passes, security may be better if the contents stay in possession. There are a few separate ways of executing the drop, and the principal uses each for different purposes. The circumstances of execution stay the same, but the method of loading and unloading may differ. Dead drops are some of the most common types of drops. The principal loads contents into a container and deposits it in a specific location. Some of the more defining characteristics of placing a dead drop is its precision. There is an exact location where the principal or resident places the container. Whether it is inside a toilet tank of an unfrequented restaurant or dangling from an external radiator of an archaic hotel, the placement of the drop is a matter of inches. Mobile drops are a dead drop on a moving platform. This uses vehicles or persons on a predictable route. One party would conceal the contents with this unwitting person, usually their vehicle, as they traveled some known route. The other party, knowing where the unwitting asset will be, intercepts the contents. This is something that drug smugglers in Europe use to get contraband cross borders. They would conceal the drugs in the bumper or underside of a caravan, and after crossing the border, an associate would retrieve the contents. If authorities catch the unwitting agent, neither party cared. Plausible deniability. The principal can change this with the use of publicly accessible transportation like ferries, buses, taxis, and so on. The moving nature of the package and how many people would come across it lends this method security. This is more difficult for surveillance and much easier for the participants. Tosses capitalizes on speed and fluidity of loading at the expense of precision. Where a dead drop may have a minute or two of seclusion, a toss is 1 second or a fraction thereof. If there is surveillance, then they are significantly less likely to see the drop. The downside is the other party must spend more time in the drop area looking for where the contents landed. These are the only way for higher risk or emergency drops where the possessor of sensitive contents must rid himself of them. The following is the execution of a drop where the resident transfers contents to the principal. The planning of this should be such that the principal knows when the resident will acquire the contents for the drop. The principal schedules this in an earlier meeting, and the resident executes the drop per the prearranged date, time, and location. Just like any other means of communication, drops start with surveillance detection. Even if the resident has some compromising materials, the only reason they had it was because of their natural placement and access to said materials in the first place. There is still an element of plausible deniability when it comes to their possession as a matter of mistake. Therefore, not all compromising materials will call for an emergency drop or destruction. If possible, the resident returns the contents in an innocent attempt to rectify a wrong. Then the principal decides whether to end the relationship with the resident. The counter-surveillance procedure is the same as others. The resident enters an area where the principal has command from an observation post, and the resident follows a route that will elicit surveillance behaviors. However, instead of making direct contact with the resident after surveillance detection, the principal sets up a signal site. This can be either some physical signal, where the principal displays some discrete, albeit obvious signal to the resident at a pre-established location, or uses a technical means. If the principal sees surveillance, then he does nothing. The resident must only execute the drop if there is a proceed signal. If there is no signal, the resident aborts and executes the instructions given to him. Instructions may include returning the contents from whence they came, destroying the contents in a secure manner, or executing an emergency drop. This will be at the principal's discretion based upon the operational circumstances. After the principal signals the resident, the principal travels to the observation post of the drop. Upon seeing the signal, the resident makes his way to one last cover stop in the area before heading to the drop site. At the drop site, the resident is to follow a specific route and be sensitive to others' behaviors. Despite checking for adversarial surveillance, the principal's and residents' next concern is the locals and their casual observation. Obstruction must seclude the drop site from other casual passerby and obstruct the view from any potential observation posts. This means, despite the observation post the principal occupies having a general command of the area, it does not directly see the specific drop site. It should be in a spot where very few people, if any, frequent, and if they do, the frequency is so rare, the principal and resident should treat any other person's presence as a threat. From the perspective of the principal's observation post, the principal can see the resident's approach into the area and have enough time and distance to gauge others' reactions or responses to the resident. Then, in the final approach, the resident ducks behind some form of obstruction from others in the area, loads the drop, and then exits from behind the obstruction and rejoins normal traffic. The resident then executes the load signal to show he loaded the drop. The signal site should be somewhere observable from the observation post. It does not necessarily have to be some persistent signal like chalk on a mailbox, as behavioral signals, like lighting a cigarette, blowing one's nose, or walking away with hands in pockets, offers benefits of not leaving any evidence behind. The principal must encourage the resident to abort the drop for any reason they feel the circumstances are unsafe. This can be the drop site is not as it should be, or there were people present behind the obstruction. An example of the former is changes to the environment since casing. If the resident is to deposit the contents behind a dumpster, but there are now 2 dumpsters, then the resident should abort the drop, as it may cause the principal to execute the unloading in an attention-drawing way. If the security concerns were temporary, then the resident may try the drop again at a later prearranged time window, usually between 12 to 24 hours later, depending on the natural patterns of the resident and what behaviors look normal. If not, or the next try fails too, then there should be an alternate or emergency drop site to get rid of the contents. Once the resident loads the contents into the drop and no security concerns exist, the principal makes his approach to the drop site. He executes the unloading in a comparable manner to the loading and exfiltrates the area. If needs be, he uses the contents for whatever he needed them or caches it for later use. Executing a drop in the opposite direction from principal to resident is very similar with just a few exceptions. Just as before, both parties should have set up a prearranged date, time, and location to start the counter-surveillance activities for the resident before he tries to unload the drop. As before any operational activity, the principal executes counter-surveillance. Then the principal gets the contents for the drop, usually from a cache, and loads the drop. The principal must do this with enough time to get to the first observation post before the resident arrives for surveillance detection. The counter-surveillance does not change. The principal watches the resident along the pre-planned route and assesses the presence of surveillance. If there is, then he does not signal. If there is not, then he signals. After the signal, the principal travels to the observation post at the drop site and watches the resident approach, retrieve, leave, and display the unload signal. If the resident does not service the drop, then the principal can try a similar time window for a second attempt. If that does not work or that is not possible, the principal should retrieve it, cache it, and try again at another alternate location. The principal sets up an alternate means of communication in case the drop was not successful. This can be a brief encounter or a technical contact where the parties quickly discuss and assess the mission. If the principal loads the contents but the resident did not retrieve it, the principal assesses whether it would be safe to check the contents at the drop. If the resident feels there was surveillance, then the principal returns only after assessing the area. If the resident could not find the drop but no threats exist, then the principal may return to ensure it is still there. If it is missing, then it is time to reassess the operation, the relationship with the resident, or both. The following locations and routes need casing. Observation posts are for the principal to watch the resident at cover stops during the counter-surveillance activities in the vicinity of the drop site. The principal may have several observation posts because of visual limitations or one well-planned post. Drop missions can be in either rural or urban environments, so how many posts will depend on the specific locations the principal decides are suitable. The principal must set up a legitimate cover for being in the area for the entire duration. This is particularly true of the observation post at the drop site. The principal must watch the resident and the others in the area to assess whether unloading can take place securely. The principal must avoid the appearance of loitering, so he is not doing anything any longer than anyone else. The loading and unloading approach routes for the resident includes the path taken from the point from which the resident will enter the intermediate area to the drop site. It includes a series of cover stops and legs that elicit surveillance behaviors. This is not as important for the principal's approach, as he performed counter-surveillance before the drop. The unloading route for the principal is from the observation post to the drop site. The principal executes this once the principal sees the unload signal from the resident and people are not paying attention to the drop site. While there is nothing wrong with the parties approaching the drop from different directions, there is no need to do so. One could argue when people do similar behaviors, including approaching from an unfrequented area from the same direction, it may raise suspicions. However, the principal uses locations which obstruct observations. The location should have some obstruction from many angles, so as any loitering persons could not see multiple people doing something similar. The safe signal site is mandatory if the resident is the recipient of the drop and optional depending on the type of contents the resident is loading into the drop. While the other methods of contact have initial contact points where the principal meets the resident, in the case of a drop, neither party makes face-to-face contact. Drops need a signal to let the resident know it is safe to continue. The resident must not see the principal, so the safe signal to the resident must be persistent enough for the resident to see it until he passes by. A drop site needs to be secure from other people. It should be readily accessible by anyone, so neither the principal nor resident are obvious when servicing it, but it should be of little importance to most people. The principal ensures this with a location that is unfrequented by others and secluded from sight and sound of any potential passerby, but not so much it is illogical or surprising. Demographics are important as the mere presence of the principal or resident can draw undue attention in the wrong areas. The more diverse, the better, because people tend to abstract those of another demographic. If the demographics are identical, the prominent or identifying features of a person are likely noticed instead of their generalized superficial features. Public behavior is what most everyone else is doing. The nature of a drop is that there is a constant flow to its execution. There is very little, if any, stopping to service the drop. The principal avoids areas where people loiter for very long, if at all. Any loiterers should be gone by the time the principal or resident services the drop. People should be moving with some purpose and often in transit from one place to another. They should be oblivious to the others around them. Even if the principal uses unfrequented roads or paths, this criterion does not change. Even if there are few people present, those who travel through should not be interested in the area or behaviors around the drop. Common behavior is not necessarily only what the majority does, but what a minority does too. Custodians or rummagers should not frequent the area. This is particularly important if the principal uses certain alleys, public facilities, or public transportation. If these people are frequenting the area to clean up or rummage, then the principal either reconsiders using it or uses a carefully cased schedule. If a party misses the drop, the principal must then retrieve the contents before someone else does. Due to this added burden, the principal avoids these areas. Timing is naming how long the parties need to service the drop. They should be minimal for both in placing and retrieving, but the principal errs on the side of making it quicker and easier for the resident. The purpose of timing is to minimize the potential observation of those who may see it. This mitigates risks. Obstruction must be present with both loading and unloading. The principal and resident may use their body or vehicle as temporary obstruction, but the act must not be obvious. The principal should find drop sites within some nook or cranny that will allow the principal to temporarily move out of sight of normal traffic. Logic addresses how odd or obvious the movement into the site would be. Ideally, a site that offers an entrance and exit to allow the route through the site, but sometimes that may not be the case. If the site only has one way in and out, there must be an obvious, self-explanatory reason for using that location, preferably common knowledge. If not, then the site should have enough traffic flow that anyone who saw the principal or resident go in should not be around to see him come out.